core problem was that the Americans were counting the wrong things entirely. While American forces in Vietnam tallied corpses like a supermarket manager counting daily inventory, Pentagon analysts thousands of miles away turned brutal jungle warfare into sanitized spreadsheets. The body count numbers climbed steadily into the tens of thousands. Yet the grim reality was that the ongoing war kept getting fundamentally worse. The massive American military machine had somehow convinced itself that outdated industrial warfare logic could be perfectly applied to a highly complex, decentralized guerrilla conflict. Robert McNamara and his Pentagon analysts absolutely loved these neat numbers because they could easily graph the rising body counts to show apparent tactical trends. They confidently used these colorful charts to desperately prove to Congress that tangible progress was being made on the ground. A general would proudly declare that they had killed 40,000 enemies this month, claiming it as undeniable proof of impending victory. The entire American strategy was tragically reduced to a simple, deadly equation. Kill more enemy combatants than you lose to grind them down. Except, this highly calculated war of attrition was completely failing in reality. The determined Viet Cong and the relentless North Vietnamese army just kept coming despite their staggering battlefield losses. Villages that were officially declared pacified on a Monday were violently hostile again by Friday. Enormous American sweep operations that successfully generated massive body counts ultimately changed nothing strategically. The American forces would aggressively roll through a designated area with overwhelming, earth-shattering firepower, count the scattered dead, declare a resounding victory, and then promptly leave the area completely unprotected. 2 weeks later, the seasoned enemy was naturally back in absolute control like they had never even left. The body count obsession had rapidly become the absolute defining metric of American military strategy. It was the single, all-important number that ambitious generals used to definitively prove they were winning and that desperate politicians used to justify the escalating war. This twisted metric became so overwhelmingly important that desperate field units inevitably started inflating their reporting numbers just to satisfy the intense, unyielding demands of their distant bureaucratic superiors. They quickly resorted to counting innocent civilian casualties as active combatants, occasionally counting the exact same bloody bodies twice, and turning warfare into a profoundly sick counting game. In this deeply corrupted environment, higher numbers meant rapid promotions, and lower numbers meant immediate career failure. This rampant corruption was rarely malicious. It was purely structural and heavily institutionalized. The rigid system ruthlessly demanded impressive numbers, and therefore, impressive numbers magically appeared on the daily reports, blinding the high command to the rapidly deteriorating reality on the muddy ground. The ultimate tragedy steadily deepened as 58,000 Americans would eventually die there, trapped inside a fundamentally flawed strategic framework. Right into the absolute center of this bureaucratic madness walked 8,000 pragmatic Australians who treated the entire body count obsession like it was a terrible joke. This dismissive attitude was not because they were failing to kill the enemy. On the contrary, they were quietly killing the enemy at astonishing operational ratios that made the elite Pentagon statisticians desperately check their complex math 3 different times. The Australians simply understood a fundamental truth of counterinsurgency that the Americans had tragically forgotten in their blind, desperate obsession with tracking tactical metrics. The harsh truth is that you absolutely do not win grueling guerrilla wars by merely counting dead farmers in the dirt. You truly win these complex conflicts by aggressively making the enemy entirely irrelevant to the local population. The dedicated Australian task force stationed in Phuoc Tuy province was not just fighting a completely different war than the overwhelming American military forces surrounding them. They were fundamentally fighting an entirely different kind of war altogether. They faced the exact same suffocating jungle, the exact same determined enemy, and mostly utilized the exact same standard-issue weaponry as their American counterparts. However, their underlying tactical philosophy and entire strategic approach meant they might as well have been operating on a completely different planet. The Australian task force initially arrived in Phuoc Tuy province back in 1966, with a remarkably modest contingent of precisely 4,500 men assigned to a single region. They were assigned to genuinely secure a single, isolated province. They were not arrogantly trying to win the entire sprawling war single-handedly. Their singular, highly focused mission was merely to make one specific province genuinely secure from the deep-rooted communist insurgency. The American military brass honestly thought this focused, limited approach was adorably modest, perhaps even quaint and hopelessly outdated. The Australians were valued geopolitical allies, certainly, but to the Pentagon elites, they were strictly small-time players operating in a massive, increasingly global ideological conflict spanning the entire country. The widespread American assumption was that the eager Australians would quietly handle their little insignificant province, while the heavily armed grown-ups would fight the real, massive war of attrition. But the Americans fundamentally failed to grasp the terrifying effectiveness of a military force that completely stopped measuring operational success by how many people they could kill. The Australians systematically sought to establish one province where the enemy absolutely could not operate freely, could not violently tax the local villages, and could not easily move their crucial military supplies. This is the compelling story of what actually happens when a military force starts measuring ultimate success by whether the enemy can actually still function. It is the remarkable story of humble farmhands from rural Queensland and pragmatic mechanics from suburban Melbourne, who rapidly became so terrifyingly effective at true counterinsurgency that the desperate North Vietnamese actively offered massive bounties on their heads. These specific bounties were notably 5 times higher than the standard rewards offered for eliminating typical American military officers operating in the exact same region. 3 grueling years later, Phuoc Tuy province was universally recognized as the absolute most secure province in the entire tactical zone. It was not merely secure in the flawed, superficial American sense of conducting big, noisy sweeps that looked exceptionally good on official paper. It was actually genuinely secure. The complex enemy infrastructure was thoroughly dismantled. The hidden supply routes were permanently cut, and the local villages remained completely pacified simply because the Viet Cong physically could not return to re-establish their previous dominance over the terrified local population. And the quiet Australians had remarkably achieved this strategic miracle with staggering kill ratios that initially made the official numbers look like clerical typos. During their entire grueling deployment, the 1st Australian Task Force lost exactly 521 men killed in action. In return, they inflicted an estimated 30,000 devastating enemy casualties, resulting in an unbelievable exchange ratio of roughly 58-1. But the crucial, mind-bending reality that the brilliant Pentagon analysts simply could not comprehend was that the pragmatic Australians completely ignored those impressive numbers. Consider the legendary Battle of Long Tan in August 1966, which perfectly encapsulated this massive tactical disparity. A severely outnumbered force of just 108 Australians was suddenly ambushed by an estimated enemy regiment of roughly 2,500 veteran fighters in a pouring rubber plantation. The terrifying engagement should have easily resulted in a complete and total massacre of the isolated Allied forces. The deeply entrenched American command heavily anticipated an absolute disaster when the desperate radio calls for immediate artillery support began echoing through the torrential afternoon rainstorm. However, the highly disciplined Australians did not panic or break their defensive lines under the overwhelming, continuous enemy fire. They systematically utilized precise, closely coordinated artillery strikes combined with incredibly disciplined small arms fire to completely shatter the massive enemy formations. When the suffocating smoke finally cleared the following morning, the battlefield was utterly unrecognizable. The Australians had tragically lost 18 brave men, but the devastated enemy had suffered unimaginable, crippling losses that left over 500 dead scattered among the shattered rubber trees, permanently neutralizing their regional offensive capabilities for years. The stunned American generals immediately looked at these staggering aftermath statistics and excitedly celebrated what they perceived as a monumental victory of pure attrition. They eagerly calculated the phenomenal body count, desperately trying to map this localized tactical success onto their massive national spreadsheets. They fundamentally assumed the pragmatic Australians would be absolutely thrilled with such an impressive, historically high kill ratio to proudly report back to their political superiors. It was the exact type of definitive, undeniable numerical victory that the deeply flawed American military establishment fundamentally craved to justify the escalating conflict. But here's the profound, incredibly uncomfortable truth that the rigid Pentagon simply could not intellectually grasp at the time. The highly professional Australians actively despised those inflated numbers and considered the horrific body count to be a grim, unfortunate byproduct of the engagement rather than the primary goal. They cared absolutely nothing about breaking statistical killing records or satisfying distant bureaucratic demands. They only cared about one incredibly specific, highly strategic question. Could the heavily devastated enemy regiment actually continue to effectively function and project power within their assigned territorial borders after the smoke cleared? The profound philosophical disconnect between these two vastly different military forces was heavily rooted in their respective institutional histories. The American military machine was incredibly accustomed to fighting massive, conventional, set-piece battles where overwhelming industrial firepower inevitably secured ultimate victory. They fundamentally believed that if you simply dropped enough heavy ordnance and killed enough armed combatants, the battered enemy would eventually be forced to surrender. This blunt, incredibly destructive First World War mentality was actively transplanted into a vibrant, living jungle environment where standard conventional battle lines simply did not exist and traditional tactics failed. Conversely, the highly adaptable Australian forces had arrived in the sweltering country with a completely different, highly refined conceptual framework. They heavily relied on the incredibly successful British Commonwealth counterinsurgency doctrines carefully developed during the grueling Malayan emergency and the dense jungles of Borneo. These vital, hard-learned historical lessons explicitly taught them that you absolutely cannot win a complex insurgency by simply killing determined fighters slightly faster than they can actively recruit replacements from the deeply terrified, highly traumatized local peasant populations scattered across the isolated rural farming villages of the volatile region. True, lasting victory in a brutal guerrilla war is ultimately achieved by methodically and ruthlessly separating the hidden insurgents from their vital civilian support networks. It requires systematically destroying their hidden supply caches, dismantling their vast logistical chains, and making their localized tactical operations absolutely impossible to execute. It demands a delicate, incredibly dangerous balance of aggressive small unit patrols and genuine community protection. The deeply entrenched Americans were stubbornly fighting an endless war of brutal industrial attrition, while the highly specialized Australians were quietly fighting a sophisticated, incredibly precise war of interconnected human systems. This dramatic, underlying tension between the overwhelming, noisy American industrial machine and the quiet, deadly Australian precision was steadily building toward a massive, inevitable collision. The vast ideological differences could not remain politely hidden behind closed doors or buried within classified operational reports forever. High-ranking careers, massive military budgets, and the ultimate strategic direction of the entire failing war were actively depending on maintaining the comfortable illusion that the flawed body count metric actually worked. Someone eventually had to forcefully speak the absolute truth, completely regardless of the severe professional consequences that would inevitably follow. The dramatic stage was now perfectly set for one of the most incredible, historically significant, and deeply uncomfortable confrontations of the entire Vietnam War. The unyielding American obsession with sanitized statistical metrics was about to violently crash directly into the blunt, unapologetic reality of true Australian counterinsurgency success. All the complex, carefully manipulated spreadsheets and colorful operational graphs in the world were about to be forcefully challenged by a single, battle-hardened junior officer who simply refused to blindly play along with the profound institutional madness that was actively losing the most controversial conflict in modern history. Major Harry Smith was not supposed to be the one to say it. He had joined the Australian Army back in 1952, serving in Korea before spending the late 50s meticulously mastering jungle warfare. By August 1969, he was a seasoned veteran of 3 grueling years in Vietnam. He was a company commander who had led countless tense patrols deep into heavily fortified enemy territory. He profoundly understood exactly what tactical methods worked and what completely failed. He was also notoriously blunt to the absolute point of severe career damage, holding a dangerous tactical truth. The critical setting was a routine inter-allied command briefing in heavily air-conditioned Saigon. Australian liaison officers regularly attended these weekly American meetings for basic coordination, standardized intelligence sharing, and the usual exhausting military bureaucracy. Smith was only there because his commanding officer was dealing with a sudden crisis back at their base in Nui Dat. Someone had to officially represent the isolated task force. The briefing meticulously covered the previous week's massive combat operations, heavily featuring an American division that had just conducted an enormous sweep straight through the contested jungles of Binh Duong province. The presented numbers were undeniably impressive on the pristine tactical chalkboards. The enthusiastic briefing officer proudly announced 432 enemy combatants killed, dozens of heavy weapons captured, and significant underground bunker complexes thoroughly destroyed. This massive operation was loudly presented to the gathered officers as a clear, unquestionable strategic success. The high-ranking audience nodded in polite agreement, completely blinded by the comforting illusion of industrial metrics. It was textbook American attrition warfare, loudly celebrating the sheer volume of destruction while entirely ignoring the complex political realities actively simmering just beneath the dark jungle canopy. The fatal turning point arrived during the standard question period. An inquisitive American colonel politely asked about planned follow-up operations and how the division intended to maintain tactical pressure on the retreating enemy forces. The confident briefing officer looked momentarily confused by the basic strategic inquiry. He quickly proudly stated that their heavily armed forces were already actively redeploying to the next designated operational area. They had successfully achieved their mandated numerical objectives, so the mission was officially accomplished. This deeply flawed assumption was the exact moment the seasoned Australian major decided to break all military decorum. Sitting quietly in the back row among the neatly pressed uniforms, Smith suddenly made a distinct sound. It was not quite a full laugh, and not quite a polite cough, but simply a dismissive noise of pure professional disbelief. In a highly formal room where junior Allied officers absolutely did not contradict powerful American generals, this tiny vocalization was effectively deafening. The imposing two-star general actively running the comprehensive briefing immediately stopped speaking and looked sharply up. He coldly demanded to know if the Australian major had something valuable to logically contribute to the ongoing tactical discussion. Australian junior officers fully understood the severe diplomatic consequences of publicly challenging American high command in front of a room packed full of field-grade officers. Smith acutely knew this dangerous reality, briefly weighing his entire military career for perhaps 2 silent seconds. He then stood up at rigid attention and politely asked what the actual objectives of the massive operation were. The general's eyes dangerously narrowed as he firmly stated it was the systematic attrition of enemy forces. Smith then softly dropped his first tactical trap, asking who actually controlled the devastated province after the Americans departed. The crowded briefing room instantly went dead quiet. The underlying tension was so thick you could clearly hear the gentle hum of the struggling air conditioning units. The general's booming voice suddenly dropped to that dangerous, quiet register that experienced career officers recognize instantly as a severe warning. He angrily reiterated that they had successfully killed 432 enemy combatants, confidently declaring that they obviously controlled the disputed territory. Smith did not flinch or back down, calmly asking how long that temporary control would last if those dead fighters were simply replaced by next week. The deeply insulted general angrily demanded to know exactly what the junior officer was insolently implying about their military strategy. Maintaining his perfectly level, almost friendly voice, Smith respectfully asked how the American command actually measured genuine success. He argued that if the smoking province looked exactly like it did before the massive military operation, then absolutely nothing of strategic value had been permanently achieved. The general's rigid face began cycling through several interesting color changes as he stubbornly defended their core doctrine. He loudly insisted they effectively maintained constant operational pressure through continuous, reliable body counts. Smith acknowledged that the Americans religiously counted dead bodies, noting that the Australians carefully read their daily after-action reports. He openly questioned if it was truly a valid measure of lasting strategic progress. This was the exact terrifying moment when Major Smith permanently crossed the invisible line from merely impertinent to dangerously insubordinate. You simply did not ever interrupt a commanding general, and you absolutely never questioned their entire foundational strategic framework in front of their loyal staff. Smith took a deep breath and deliberately did it anyway, completely changing the historical narrative of the entire Allied war. Sir, with absolute respect, the Australian task force simply does not count bodies, because we never have, and we measure completely different things, Smith stated with chilling clarity. The absolute silence in that heavily guarded briefing room lasted for 8 agonizing seconds. The shocked general leaned aggressively forward, sarcastically asking what trivial things the small Allied force actually cared to measure. Smith calmly began ticking vital strategic indicators off on his steady fingers. He asked if the enemy could still actively operate, secretly tax the local villages, move critical hidden supplies, effectively recruit, or execute meaningful political control. We honestly do not care exactly how many anonymous fighters we kill, unless killing them permanently changes those specific logistical things, and most of the time it simply does not, Smith elaborated flatly. A panicked lieutenant colonel desperately tried to verbally salvage the rapidly deteriorating diplomatic situation, loudly insisting that the daily body count was a vital measurement of military progress. Smith ruthlessly cut the senior officer off, declaring that you could blindly kill 1,000 low-level insurgents and accomplish absolutely nothing if their resilient underground political infrastructure magically remained entirely intact to perfectly continue the ongoing present asymmetric war. They will effortlessly replace those dead soldiers in a single month. But if you carefully hunt and kill 20 of the exact right people like the hidden political officers, the logistics specialists, the local commanders, you successfully cripple them, Smith expertly explained. He emphasized that successfully destroying hidden supply caches, permanently interdicting secret jungle trails, and making local villages genuinely hostile to enemy presence meant winning something real. The general's voice turned to absolute ice as he challengingly asked if the arrogant Australian major had actually achieved this seemingly impossible standard of counterinsurgency in his own deeply contested operational province. Smith confidently replied in the affirmative, proudly stating they had successfully made Phuoc Tui the absolute most secure province in the entire tactical core area. He specifically highlighted that they achieved this monumental task using merely a tiny fraction of the overwhelming American forces available. The crucial difference was that they did not aggressively try to kill the absolute most people. They simply focused entirely on making offensive enemy operations logistically impossible. This blunt, undeniable declaration of tactical superiority completely shattered the polite decorum, causing the entire crowded briefing room to immediately erupt into furious, highly chaotic shouting. The incredibly intense shouting match loudly echoed down the pristine hallways for 10 agonizing minutes. 3 different furious American colonels desperately tried to lecture Major Smith on why their precious body counts were a mathematically valid metric for winning the war. Smith relentlessly responded with sharp, devastating tactical questions that they simply could not logically answer. He ruthlessly asked why the war was not getting any better if their continuous attrition strategy actually worked. If killing fighters faster than they could be replaced was the master plan, why were there more heavily armed enemy troops in the country today? The deeply humiliated 2-star general finally slammed his hand down, angrily shutting down the chaotic argument. He coldly informed Major Smith that his highly insolent observations were officially noted and abruptly dismissed him to return to his isolated task force. The dark, threatening tone heavily suggested that the junior officer should immediately expect a severe, career-ending diplomatic incident. Smith smartly saluted the furious general, turned on his heel, and confidently left the tense briefing room. He fully expected to be harshly reprimanded and quietly recalled to Australia for daring to loudly expose the massive American strategic failure. You simply did not tell powerful American generals that their entire strategic framework was a complete tactical disaster and expect to walk away clean. However, something incredibly strange and historically significant happened instead of the expected bureaucratic punishment. Exactly 3 days later, A highly specialized team of elite Pentagon analysts unexpectedly showed up at the dusty Australian base at Nui Dat. They did not come to arrest Major Smith or officially reprimand the tiny Allied force. They quietly came to closely observe these radically different Australian operations and desperately understand what true, measurable tactical success actually looked like. The skeptical Australian Task Force commander, Brigadier Stuart Graham, initially doubted the true intentions of the visiting Pentagon analysts at Nui Dat. He had dealt with arrogant American observers before who usually watched for a single day, concluded small-scale operations were utterly useless for a global superpower, and promptly left. But these particular analysts were completely different because they had actually read the detailed after-action reports and noticed Phuoc Tui's security indicators were miraculously trending upward. They desperately wanted to understand why this isolated province was actually secure, so Graham cautiously assigned them to deeply observe Delta Company. Delta Company was precisely the legendary unit commanded by Major Harry Smith, the very men who adamantly refused to count bodies. These hardened soldiers came from quiet suburbs, dusty farms, and breezy coastal towns that most American generals absolutely could not locate on a map. Private Kevin Wheatley, universally known as Dasher, had previously been a rugged jackaroo working isolated cattle stations in rural New South Wales. Before joining the disciplined army, his entire world consisted merely of dirt roads, wild stock horses, and rusty fencing wire, having never fired a lethal weapon at another human being. Corporal Barry Mackenzie, affectionately called Blue, had peacefully shaped custom surfboards in the coastal town of Torquay before the brutal war. His skilled hands intimately knew soft foam and sticky resin, not heavy rifle stocks and deadly fragmentation grenades. His absolute biggest daily worry back home had simply been whether the ocean surf would be reasonably good on the upcoming weekend. Private Jim Richmond had been a standard diesel mechanic apprentice in suburban Brisbane, fixing broken trucks, drinking cold beer with his loyal mates, and casually dating a local girl who worked at the neighborhood chemist. Exactly 6 grueling months of intensive military training deliberately turned these ordinary young men into something entirely different and incredibly dangerous. This profound transformation did not happen overnight through sheer magic, but through a highly specific, painstakingly deliberate process that the professional Australian Army had ruthlessly refined over decades. Their comprehensive training was heavily centered at the infamous Canungra Jungle Warfare School, located deep in the steep, unforgiving mountains behind the sunny Gold Coast. Those 6 agonizing weeks systematically broke down absolutely everything these fresh recruits mistakenly thought they instinctively knew about surviving brutal infantry combat. This brutal curriculum was specifically built for a suffocating jungle environment where terrified soldiers could not see 50 meters ahead. They painstakingly learned to carefully move completely silently through sharp vegetation so incredibly thick that they literally had to blindly feel their way forward. They meticulously learned to shoot highly accurately in tiny 3-second tactical windows when the dense jungle canopy briefly opened up just enough to clearly identify a hidden target. Most importantly, they learned to truly listen, because hearing a rusty rifle safety click off might be the only brief warning they ever received. The absolute most vital transformation they underwent at Canungra was fundamentally mental rather than purely physical, focusing heavily on extreme patience. Standard American military doctrine aggressively emphasized rapid speed, overwhelming firepower, and massive violence of action to quickly crush the enemy. That conventional approach worked perfectly in traditional warfare, but in the dense Vietnamese jungle, it simply got loud soldiers quickly killed. The pragmatic Australians deliberately learned to silently wait, to carefully watch, and to spend 8 agonizing hours lying completely motionless while observing a suspected trail junction without making a single detectable sound. Through this extreme discipline, Dasher Wheatley, the former jackaroo, became an elite combat tracker who could effortlessly follow hidden enemy footprints. He could expertly read deeply disturbed leaves, immediately notice jungle grass bent the wrong tactical way, and easily spot a tiny footprint in soft mud that was exactly 6 hours old. Blue Mackenzie utilized his artistic hands to become a brilliant forward scout who could completely silently move through the treacherous jungle like invisible smoke. He learned to quickly recognize the 1,000 tiny visual signals that meant a deadly ambush or hidden bunker was nearby. Jim Richmond, the suburban mechanic, seamlessly became a devastatingly precise machine gunner who could completely strip his heavy weapon in total darkness. He could expertly clear a mechanical jam entirely by touch and relentlessly lay down, suppressing fire with such terrifying precision that he bracketed enemy positions without wasting precious ammunition. These men were not magically transformed into indestructible super soldiers by the strict military academy. They were simply transformed into highly competent tactical professionals who deeply understood their terrifying environment, creating a massive operational difference that the visiting Pentagon analysts were about to personally witness. The eager Pentagon analysts cautiously followed the highly disciplined Delta Company on what the Australians considered a standard, routine jungle patrol. However, standard by strict Australian military definition meant something completely alien and utterly terrifying by conventional American tactical standards. The silent patrol permanently left the fortified Nui Dat base at exactly 0400 hours, consisting of exactly 38 heavily armed men. They carried light weapons, reliable rifles, heavy machine guns, deadly grenades, and claymore mines. But absolutely no pre-planned artillery support, no standby evacuation helicopters, and no massive logistical supply tail following behind them. The confused American observers fully expected a standard route patrol with a highly predictable course to simply check predetermined map objectives. Delta Company absolutely did not patrol like that, instead moving completely silently to wherever local intelligence indicated a refresh enemy presence. Sometimes that meant patiently following a hidden jungle trail for 12 exhausting hours, and sometimes it meant sitting completely motionless in a miserable ambush position for 2 full days. They were heavily hunting a specific logistics courier who might not even come, deliberately working a single grid square so incredibly thoroughly that nothing escaped their watch. On the very first exhausting day, the heavily burdened patrol only covered a remarkably short distance of barely 3 total kilometers. The frustrated American analysts were deeply confused by this crawling pace, loudly pointing out that you would never comprehensively cover the assigned area. A seasoned Delta Company sergeant just smiled coldly at the arrogant visitors, quietly whispering that they were not blindly trying to cover useless ground, but actively trying to find the hidden enemy. This extreme patience immediately paid off on the incredibly tense second day when the silent point man suddenly halted the patrol. They had successfully found incredibly fresh tactical sign indicating exactly 5 armed men moving rapidly north, likely a highly trained reconnaissance team. The excited Americans immediately expected aggressive pursuit, demanding they furiously call in heavily armed helicopters and rapidly set up a massive blocking cordon. Major Smith coldly looked at the analysts like they were completely insane, absolutely refusing to engage the tiny scouting element. He quietly ordered his disciplined patrol to simply follow the enemy team from a safe distance, expertly hooking the hidden prey to eventually discover whatever massive secret they were actively guarding. The frustrated Pentagon analysts simply could not comprehend why Major Smith actively refused to annihilate the vulnerable enemy reconnaissance team. You have sudden tactical contact, so why aren't you violently engaging them right now? One embedded analyst demanded in a harsh whisper. Smith coldly looked at the bewildered Americans like they had foolishly suggested burning down the entire jungle just to clear the thick vegetation. He calmly explained that those 5 lowly scouts were absolutely not the primary target, because whatever secret facility they were actively scouting for was the real strategic prize waiting to be violently dismantled. If we impatiently kill them right now for a cheap body count, we will absolutely never find their hidden logistical center, Smith whispered intensely to the American observers. The silent Australian patrol painstakingly followed the completely unaware Viet Cong team for 18 agonizing hours through the suffocating green darkness. The overconfident enemy was not even slightly trying to cleverly hide their muddy trail, mistakenly believing they were operating securely within perfectly safe communist territory. This fatal arrogance seamlessly led Delta Company straight toward a massive, heavily camouflaged way station carefully hidden deep within a shadowy stream valley. This highly secretive logistical hub contained reinforced underground bunkers, massive weapon caches, highly sensitive administrative documents, and sophisticated radio equipment. Although the sprawling jungle facility was temporarily empty at that specific moment, it was incredibly obvious to the experienced trackers that it remained in constant active use. The anxious American analysts immediately demanded to aggressively call in a devastating airstrike to completely destroy the vulnerable facility right now. They foolishly assumed that obliterating the empty bamboo structures would officially constitute a massive tactical victory that would look incredibly impressive on the daily Pentagon operational spreadsheets. Major Smith flatly denied their frantic request, fully knowing that if they simply bombed the empty camp, the resilient enemy would easily rebuild another one tomorrow. Instead, he meticulously positioned a deadly, perfectly coordinated ambush, deliberately placing his silent men not on the station itself, but strategically along the primary approach trails. Then, the heavily armed Australians simply melted into the thick surrounding vegetation and began an agonizingly long, utterly silent wait. The profound physical and psychological discipline required to lie completely motionless in the biting insects and sweltering tropical heat was something the Americans fundamentally lacked. For 31 excruciating hours, the highly disciplined soldiers of Delta Company waited without making a single detectable sound or sudden movement. The embedded Pentagon analysts were slowly losing their minds from the severe physical discomfort and the terrifying psychological tension of the silent jungle. They repeatedly urged Smith to just violently destroy the camp and quickly return to the comfortable base. Smith ruthlessly maintained his absolute discipline, quietly explaining that he specifically wanted the crucial people who regularly utilized this facility, including the senior logistics officers and the vital political cadre who actually mattered strategically. Finally, at the deeply exhausting 32nd hour, the unsuspecting enemy finally returned to the hidden jungle sanctuary, completely unaware of their impending doom. It was absolutely not the original 5 lowly scouts who walked down the narrow dirt trail, but a highly valuable logistics team consisting of exactly 11 heavily armed men. Most importantly, 3 of these confident individuals were clearly high-ranking political officers based entirely on their pristine uniforms and specialized equipment. They carelessly walked straight into the deadly kill zone without ever realizing that Delta Company had been lying 10 meters away for over a day. Displaying terrifying tactical patience, Major Smith deliberately let the high-value targets get completely comfortable within their supposedly secure jungle hideout. He silently watched as they casually set down their heavy weapons, removed their burdensome field gear, and finally allowed themselves to completely relax. Only when they were completely vulnerable did Smith ruthlessly initiate the perfectly coordinated ambush with devastating, overwhelming precision. The ensuing catastrophic firefight lasted exactly 20 terrifying seconds, resulting in 11 high-ranking enemy combatants permanently eliminated, while the highly professional Australians suffered absolutely 0 casualties during the flawlessly executed lightning-fast jungle assault. The massive underground supply cache was immediately secured, but the absolute greatest tactical prize was the mountain of highly classified administrative documents captured intact. These incredibly valuable papers explicitly identified 3 additional secret way stations and explicitly named 17 previously unknown Viet Cong political officers actively operating throughout Phuoc Tuy province. The official body count for this grueling operation was remarkably only 11 dead enemies, which seemed statistically insignificant to the American brass. However, the true strategic result was an entire regional logistics network completely compromised and successfully dismantled during 3 subsequent weeks of relentless follow-up operations. As the dust settled, one of the utterly stunned Pentagon analysts quietly asked why the Australian radio man had not excitedly reported the official body count to headquarters. The young radio operator, a former suburban bank teller from Adelaide, looked at the American officer with genuine, unfeigned operational confusion. He innocently asked why they would ever bother transmitting such useless numerical statistics over the vulnerable radio waves. He nonchalantly mentioned they might eventually toss the meaningless kill tally into the final written after-action report just to satisfy the Americans, but absolutely nobody in the Australian task force cared. "We successfully got exactly what we silently came for, mate," the radio man concluded flatly, leaving the American analyst to frantically write down the profound quote verbatim. The visiting Pentagon experts were rapidly realizing that the deliberate Australian counterinsurgency approach was absolutely not softer than the overwhelming American doctrine. In brutal reality, it was infinitely harder because it fundamentally demanded significantly more psychological discipline, infinitely more tactical patience, and vastly superior professional infantry skill. The massive American military machine was incredibly loud, hopelessly predictable, and completely reliant on overwhelming industrial firepower to mask its glaring tactical deficiencies. A major structural flaw actively destroying American military effectiveness was their highly destructive individual personnel rotation policy that completely shattered vital unit cohesion. A drafted soldier randomly did his mandatory 12 months in the hellish jungle, desperately survived, quietly went home, and was immediately replaced by a terrified rookie. The infantry unit was essentially a hollow bureaucratic shell that isolated individuals temporarily passed through, meaning hard-earned tactical experience was constantly bleeding away. Conversely, the highly professional Australian units deployed together, trained together, brutally fought together, organically learned from their fatal mistakes, and eventually went home together. Delta Company inherently remained Delta Company, boasting the exact same familiar faces, the very same trusted section leaders, and a massive reservoir of accumulated tactical knowledge. Furthermore, standard American infantry patrols were incredibly loud, constantly generating excessive radio chatter, clanking mechanical noise, and relying on roaring aerial support. The highly experienced enemy could easily hear the clumsy Americans clumsily thrashing through the jungle from several kilometers away. Meanwhile, the stealthy Australian patrols moved completely silently, using only subtle hand signals, effectively becoming a deadly, invisible part of the living jungle instead of noisy, vulnerable intruders blundering within it. Finally, massive American military operations always had strict, highly predictable time limits that the observant enemy effortlessly learned to perfectly exploit. They would aggressively go out for 3 noisy days, predictably return to their fortified bases, and comfortably rest, allowing the resilient insurgents to simply wait them out. Australian tactical operations pragmatically lasted exactly as long as absolutely necessary, whether that meant 5, 8, or 12 exhausting days in the miserable mud. They stubbornly stayed out in the unforgiving wilderness until they definitively accomplished their specific strategic mission, making their deadly movements completely unpredictable to the terrified enemy. The devastating Pentagon team report officially hit the massive American military command in Saigon exactly like a live fragmentation grenade tossed into a crowded briefing room. It was highly diplomatic, professionally written, and desperately bent over backwards to avoid directly criticizing the American leadership. But the strategic implications were utterly undeniable. The detailed report formally noted that Australian tactical operations achieved significantly higher strategic impact per enemy casualty inflicted. In bureaucratic Pentagon language, this document was practically screaming that the entire American approach to the Vietnam War was fundamentally wrong. 3 furious American generals desperately tried to permanently bury the controversial report, loudly arguing that it was based on a statistically insignificant sample size. They stubbornly claimed the comparisons were totally invalid because the tiny Allied force merely had a much smaller provincial area to secure. However, those damning numbers simply would not go away, and someone eventually leaked the classified report to eager investigative journalists. A prominent reporter quickly embedded with an Australian unit, writing a massive feature asking incredibly uncomfortable questions about why fewer resources achieved vastly superior results. The deeply entrenched American obsession with the daily body count slowly started to crack under this massive public pressure, although not completely. The massive military system possessed far too much institutional inertia, and countless high-ranking careers completely depended on those specific metrics staying relevant. While some progressive American field commanders bravely started adopting small-scale operations and questioning their own inflated body count reports, it was tragically too little and far too late. By 1969, the controversial war was already completely lost politically, strategically, and fundamentally beyond any tactical repair. Major Harry Smith miraculously never got into any official trouble for his incredibly blunt confrontation inside that tense Saigon briefing room. The widely expected diplomatic incident entirely failed to materialize. and instead, the brilliant tactician was quickly promoted to lieutenant colonel. He spent the remainder of his illustrious military career relentlessly teaching the next generation of infantry officers to chase strategic impact instead of useless numerical metrics. The highly disciplined Australian task force eventually left a perfectly secure Phuoc Tui province in 1972, having suffered 521 tragic losses. After the incredibly effective Australians finally departed, the highly pacified province completely collapsed within a few short, chaotic months. The deeply corrupt South Vietnamese forces absolutely could not maintain the delicate security, allowing the resilient Viet Cong to aggressively return and rebuild their shattered infrastructure. By 1975, Phuoc Tui tragically fell to the massive North Vietnamese army, exactly like everywhere else in the doomed country. This specific tragedy deeply haunted the aging Australian veterans who had undeniably proven that authentic counterinsurgency could actually work when it was executed properly. Despite the ultimate strategic collapse, those vital tactical lessons miraculously survived and slowly filtered through the massive American military establishment for decades. When American Special Operations Forces actively developed modern counterinsurgency doctrine in the 1980s and 90s, they meticulously studied the Australian approach. They finally embraced the crucial emphasis on genuine population security over generating massive enemy casualties. When the grinding wars in Iraq and Afghanistan eventually started, some enlightened American units perfectly understood that violently sweeping through neighborhoods without completely dismantling the underlying insurgent infrastructure accomplished absolutely nothing. The highly skilled men who fiercely refused to count dead bodies eventually came home to a divided country that did not care what they had miraculously achieved. Dasher Wheatley, the rugged jackaroo turned elite combat tracker, quietly survived the brutal war and peacefully returned to working isolated cattle stations. He rarely talked about the intense combat, merely telling curious people that he had gone on some incredibly long walks in very unpleasant conditions. However, he always moved quietly through the dusty brush, still expertly reading tracks in the dirt, forever changed. Blue Mackenzie, the creative surfboard shaper who transformed into a deadly jungle scout, also survived and peacefully returned to working with foam and sticky resin. But his skilled hands distinctly remembered terrifying things, and he would frequently wake up at 3 a.m, intensely listening to the absolute silence. He never publicly discussed the paralyzing terror or the agonizing nights spent lying motionless in muddy ambush positions. He merely told his young nephew that while the Americans desperately wanted big numbers, his disciplined unit only wanted genuine, undeniable, strategic results. Jim Richmond, the suburban mechanic who became a devastatingly precise machine gunner, quietly went back to fixing heavy diesel engines and drinking cold beer in Brisbane. He never once bothered to count the exact number of enemy combatants he had personally killed during those terrifying jungle firefights. He fully understood that meticulously counting those grim statistics seemed entirely pointless when the only thing that truly mattered was whether his loyal section survived. He knew that raw numbers fundamentally do not tell you absolutely anything that truly matters in a complex guerrilla war. The angry, 2-star American general who had furiously demanded to know how the Australians measured tactical success eventually understood the profound truth years later. After the spectacular fall of Vietnam, he carefully read the declassified Australian after-action reports and finally saw the spectacular operational results. He witnessed a province completely secured, massive refugee flows actually reversing, and villages voluntarily providing vital intelligence. He quietly wrote a highly professional letter to the Australian commander, functionally confessing that their tiny allied force had actively demonstrated a level of strategic competence truly worthy of intensive study. The controversial phrase, "we do not count bodies," eventually became famous, consistently showing up in modern military history books and elite staff college lectures worldwide. It became the ultimate shorthand for a highly professional philosophy of modern warfare that absolutely refused to treat human soldiers like disposable chess pieces. Some ignorant critics mistakenly interpreted it as sheer Allied arrogance, entirely missing the profound point that a skilled surgeon does not measure success by counting incisions. You must always measure ultimate success by whether you actually achieve the mandated strategic objective. The brilliant Australians always remembered to keep their sharp eyes focused entirely on what truly mattered throughout the darkest days of the devastating conflict. They accurately measured their ultimate success by whether they were fundamentally winning the complex war, not by how many desperate people they had violently killed. In their specific province, for the grueling years they fought there, they genuinely, undeniably won the tactical fight. The local villages were deeply secure. The terrified enemy absolutely could not operate, and the resilient infrastructure was destroyed, proving forever that numbers constantly lie, but undeniable results simply do not. Every few years, some chaotic global conflict unexpectedly emerges where a desperate modern military tragically decides that raw body counts are a fantastic metric once again. They foolishly convince themselves that blind attrition warfare perfectly works if you just aggressively apply enough explosive firepower against the hidden insurgents. And every single time, it completely fails because you absolutely cannot defeat a determined, decentralized insurgency by simply killing slightly more desperate people than they can actively recruit. The pragmatic Australians deeply knew this fundamental truth back in 1966, and they brilliantly tried to teach it. The ultimate tragedy was absolutely not that the highly disciplined Australians had somehow failed, because they genuinely succeeded at everything they were specifically asked to do. The profound historical tragedy was that perfect tactical success simply could not compensate for massive, overwhelming strategic failure orchestrated by distant politicians. However, the vital military lessons gloriously survived the horrific ashes of the Vietnam War to heavily influence modern counterinsurgency doctrines. They permanently demonstrated that true victory inherently requires immensely difficult questions, incredible tactical patience, and brave officers willing to tell powerful generals that they are counting the wrong things.